Be ready in a few seconds, Andy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us for this week's Greater Manchester COVID-19 briefing. Just me today, so maybe be able to get through more of your questions. What I want to do is obviously take you through the latest situation and the latest figures, and then take you through some announcements that we're making today. Major announcements linked to recovery, 3 consultations that will go to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority at the end of next week for approval. But I'll come on to that in a moment. Let me start with today's figures, and I'll ask the team to put the slide up in front of you. We're trying to improve the way we present this to you all of the while and give you more information. Obviously, as the data has started to come through to us, we're able now to give a more complete picture to you. You'll notice some change from the figures we presented last week. That's because we were giving you the most up-to-date figures as of last week, but now we've come more in alignment with Public Health England with regard to kind of figures that aren't the most up-to-date because they can be revised upwards. So these figures are, as I say, more in alignment, and we believe as a result more accurate. This is the rolling 7-day average, and you can see for Greater Manchester as a whole, we continue to be on a downward trajectory from 16.3 cases 3 or 4 weeks ago down to 12.3 today per 100,000 population. But obviously within that there is some considerable variation. Most of the boroughs, pleased to say, heading in a downwards direction. Bolton, which had been a concern a couple of weeks ago, very much back in a better position. An increase in Bury, but we still think that's on a low number of cases. Obviously, we'll be watching carefully, but low number. Manchester showing a steady downward trajectory. Oldham too have been high. If we look back at the start of the graph, down to a figure much more in line with other authorities now. I'll come back to Rochdale. Salford had been at 14 last week, down to 10. Again, the other boroughs, some increase. Trafford a small increase. Wigan a small increase on last week, but these are all figures that on a very low number of cases. Of course, the borough that stands out is Rochdale, and you'll know that we are working very closely with them, with Public Health England. Obviously, the council are in the lead and are taking all of the steps, have been very much on top of this situation and remain very much on top of this situation. What this shows, we think, is if you look at the data across the 4 weeks, that there's been fluctuation, of course, but broadly it's kind of in the same kind of level, a slight increase over the last week. This reflects cases in the Pillar 2 data, so the wider community testing, not in the Pillar 1 data. We think it's partly explained by a higher number of cases, and as you can see over the last week, a rising number of cases in some places. But we would also say that Rochdale has the highest testing rate of any of the Greater Manchester boroughs, and is 6th highest in the country. So it does also reflect the number of tests that are being carried out within the borough. So the feeling is that the cases have broadly stayed at a similar level, but are not coming down quickly enough, and hence the extra measures that have been introduced. And I would want to take this opportunity today to reiterate the advice that's being given out by Rochdale NPC, and that is for people to not wait for the rule change on face coverings in shops, to wear them now. and to wear them as much as possible when out and about. It's to limit the number of visitors to your home to a maximum of 2. Observe 2-meter distancing, full 2-meter distancing at all times. It's of course to isolate, to get tested and to isolate if necessary. So the guidance obviously is very clear. We'd encourage everybody to follow it. We believe the situation is being watched carefully as far as possible. All the right measures are being taken, and of course we continue to work closely with our partners Rochdale and Public Health England to keep on top of the situation. If I might just turn more to the bigger picture for a moment, we were pleased that the government agreed to our request at the weekend to provide patient identifiable data to the to all Greater Manchester authorities, but actually all councils in the country. And we think this will hugely enhance efforts on the ground to trace those testing positive, and then to get all the necessary measures put in place. At the same time at the weekend, data came out from the national test and trace system, which showed a worryingly low rate of successful tracing in some boroughs in Greater Manchester, most notably Oldham, Rochdale and Manchester, all below half of contacts being successfully traced. So I've got 2 requests today for the government to reiterate similar things that I said at the weekend, but I will be coming back to these points because we believe they are crucial in filling some of the gaps that we've now got in our defences at a local level. The first is to help our councils use this patient identifiable data that they're now receiving to improve contact tracing, and in particular fill the gaps left by the national system. So the first request is for resources to be released to councils, financial or in terms of staff, so that they can increase contact tracing efforts on the ground. And we think of the £10 billion that's been allocated to the national test and trace system, we think some of that resource now should be redirected to councils so that we can supplement the efforts of the national system by highly effective contact tracing on the ground. The second appeal is one that you've heard me make before, but I think becomes more and more important the deeper we go into this year, and obviously as we now look towards the winter on the horizon, and that is to enable all people to self-isolate and follow the government's advice. The reality is there are too many people in not just communities in Greater Manchester, across the north of England, who are not in a position to follow a request from the test and trace system because they know they won't be paid if they take time off work. Now, this is a major loophole, I think, in our response to COVID-19. We need everybody to be in a position where they can follow the government's advice with peace of mind, i.e. they receive pay to isolate. And we call on the government to put in place arrangements to enable this to happen, and that people shouldn't face any financial detriment from doing the right thing and following the government's advice. And then and only then, once we've got those arrangements in place, do I think we will see the numbers of people successfully being traced and then self-isolating increasing to the levels we need to see across all of our communities. So I'll leave it there on the current situation with our response to COVID-19. And if I may, I'll turn to recovery and some important documents which are being released just about now that are going to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority meeting a week on Friday. And this is all about Greater Manchester's response to Greater Manchester's recovery, building back better, as you've heard me say before, but specifically in this case, building back greener. We think it's very important that we emerge from this crisis with clarity about Greater Manchester's future direction, and in particular our plans to accelerate progress to a zero carbon Greater Manchester by 2038. That makes sense from a health point of view, but also from an economic point of view. So the consultation proposals that will be going to the combined authority are very much about re-establishing a sense of momentum around the ambitions that we have for a greener Greater Manchester. So the first is coming back to a plan you will have heard about before, the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, and the proposal will be that we go out for a further period of consultation on a revised Greater Manchester Spatial Framework in November this year for an 8-week period. The revised plan would first have to be signed off by the leaders of Greater Manchester, but it would also, before it goes out for consultation, have to go through all 10 of our councils. So this is a really important part of the democratic process here. Every councillor in Greater Manchester will have the opportunity to consider the revised draft before allowing it to go out to consultation. And of course, if it then goes out to consultation, every citizen of Greater Manchester will also have the right then to have their say on the revised draft. The main thing I would want to say on this is, in some ways, to anticipate a question that people may have about this, which would be to say, well, why now? Why accelerate this now, given that the world has changed and there is so much we don't know yet about the path towards the recovery from COVID? The main answer to that question is it's going to be a long time until we know the full effects of how this crisis is going to affect our economy. And if we were to sort of wait for that evidence, we would be leaving our green belt unprotected for a very long period of time indeed. And we're not prepared to do that. We're not prepared to see unplanned development across Greater Manchester. It's very important that we have a plan in place. But at the same time, by having a plan, we think that puts us in the strongest position to recover, because then we have clarity around the sites that have been approved for development. We're very pleased in the last round of government funding to secure £81 million of funding to remediate brownfield land. That again will help us reduce the call on the green belt. But it's because we're prepared to go forward. I think we're being successful in bringing in resource from the government, and we will be in a position to benefit from the government's build initiative, and hence the need to bring forward this plan, both to protect the green belt, but actually to get that development flowing where we are agreed it should happen, and to give that clarity to potential investors in Greater Manchester. So that's the first consultation. The second two are connected, and this is on Greater Manchester's proposals for clean air, and linked to that are a plan to develop minimum taxi licensing standards across our 10 boroughs. So just to say something first on the clean air plan. Of course, we've all been enjoying the benefits of clean air in this recent period, and it is right to try and keep those benefits going forward, to capture that health benefit, particularly for our poorest communities, which are most affected by polluted air. It's the poorest kids in the poorest communities who breathe in most polluted air, and that is something that we simply shouldn't tolerate. But in some ways, this is not our choice. Greater Manchester's councils are under a legal direction from the government to introduce measures to make the air compliant, and actually under a clear direction that a clean air zone should be the default option in considering how to do that. So, as you know, we have been developing our plans for some considerable time. We do have to act quickly because we do need to demonstrate that we are taking steps to ensure compliance at the earliest possible opportunity. And the proposal today is to go out for a further round of consultation in October on a clean air zone covering all 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester that initially will cover HGVs, buses and taxis, and that will come in 2022, and then later to cover light goods vehicles, vans as well. Now, just to say something about the timing of this, because again, there will be people out there saying, is this the right time? And can businesses manage this given all of the other pressures that they're facing? And that is obviously a fair question. I don't want to see a single job or a single business lost in Greater Manchester as a result of introducing a clean air zone. I say again, it's something we are being required to do in law, the right thing to do, but we are being required to do it, and we have not a great deal of leeway here over the timing of its introduction. So we don't want to see any damage to the economy, and I believe we can establish a cross-party consensus in Greater Manchester behind this proposal, but as long as the government now helps us with the funding needed to support businesses, to support taxi drivers, to make the shift to cleaner vehicles. And we haven't yet secured all of that funding. So in many ways, this is a cross-party appeal that is going out from Greater Manchester to the government, which is to give us the funding that we're asking for on taxis, on vans in particular, so that we can put in place practical support to help people switch vehicles. If that support isn't forthcoming, there would be a risk of what people would see as a government clean air tax at this particular difficult moment in time. And we don't think that is something the government wants to impose, and it's certainly something that we don't want to impose in Greater Manchester. This scheme is not about revenue raising. It's not a congestion charge. If it's to be successful, it will raise no money because it will encourage everybody to change their vehicles. That is what we want, and we're again just making that appeal to the government, particularly at this moment in time when businesses are facing extra challenges. We do need that financial support to help people switch vehicles, but of course that can be a support to business at this time, but also can support the clean vehicle industry across the country and provide a stimulus to manufacturers of those vehicles. So that's our proposal on clean air. We think it's very important to go out to consultation. Alongside that, the third and final consultation is on minimum taxi licensing standards. We see this as important too in terms of the clean air proposals. We want to move to a more modern fleet across Greater Manchester, higher standards, cleaner vehicles, and we don't want businesses to see a confusion between our clean air requirements and our licensing requirements. And that's why we've aligned these two consultations. We want people to change vehicles once and then to be sure in the knowledge that they don't have to change again. So these plans are about moving towards cleaner vehicles, single livery, so white for private hire, black for hackney carriages. This is part of Greater Manchester becoming a world-class city. You would expect to see a consistent taxi fleet in any other city of Greater Manchester's size around the world. This is about lifting the bar and creating a modern, consistent taxi fleet across our 10 boroughs, in the same way that we have ambitions to have single livery integrated public transport across other modes as well. So this proposal for minimum taxi licensing standards supports our clean air ambitions, but also supports our ambitions for London-style integrated public transport across Greater Manchester, which is another example of how we propose to build back better. The government will be making more announcements about transport in the north in the coming days, but I certainly want to work in partnership with them now to accelerate progress on transport reform in Greater Manchester, and that too is the right way to go coming out of this crisis. So apologise for the long introduction, but there's a lot that we're putting out there today. Thanks for your patience in listening to all of that. Ross, I will now hand over to you to take us through colleagues' questions.
Thanks very much. We've got a number of questions on Rochdale, but there's one question before that just on sport. Adam Clark from Roch Valley Radio asks, the Greater Manchester Cricket League returns this Saturday and will return with no restrictions in place for spectators. But when non-league football returns, games are initially going to be played behind closed doors. He's asking, how is this fair when both sports get similar numbers of supporters?
It's a good question, Adam. I would have said myself that cricket wouldn't attract the same number of supporters, but I stand to be corrected on that. But obviously at cricket grounds, there's often more space to distance. You're talking of a much wider open space than when you consider your average football, even non-league football ground, and obviously that more of them have smaller stands, so the issue there of more enclosed spaces. So it's a fair question. I would want to support all sports to recover out of this. I think it's a good thing that cricket are able to bring some people back to watch. I think that is linked to the environment of cricket grounds. But obviously I'd be supporting our non-league football clubs going forward to get a sensible approach from the government to enable them to begin to bring some revenue back too.
Thanks, Andy. Elizabeth Rushton from the Rochdale Observer has a couple of questions. She asked, do you feel that communities like Rochdale have been let down by the delay in the delivery of patient identifiable data to local authorities? And she said, we've also seen suggestions this week that poorer communities are reporting amongst the highest infection rates nationwide. You tweeted that tackling this would be you and the GMCA's next campaign. What do you and your colleagues plan to do to realise this?
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. On your first question, the only way I can answer that is to say yes. We've been calling for data, particularly that named patient data, for a long time. And I think it's just a fact to say that we didn't always get a straight answer from the government, and it has taken a long time to put this picture together. And it hasn't come quickly enough. However, let's put it more positively now. At least now it is flowing. And I checked earlier this week, the government said at the weekend that they would now provide this enhanced level of data. It is now coming through. So we are where we are. Let's move forward from here and try and rebuild a sense of partnership with the government. And that's very much what I had in mind when I was talking about them releasing more funding to employ more contact tracers on the ground, to do it the old-fashioned way. And I think that is one way that we will lift the level of people traced successfully in our communities. When I tweeted about the next campaign, I was very much focusing on how our poorer communities are struggling to comply with the requests that people are receiving from the test and trace system. And there is some anecdotal evidence to say that people aren't following up the messages they receive because they just know they won't be able to self-isolate, and therefore don't want to be put in a position where they have to say to a contact tracer that they can't do it. And this, of course, relates to the fact that there are millions of people who do not have any access to statutory sick pay, who know they won't be paid if they have to take time off work. They may risk losing their job if they do that. There's no protection for them there. But even people who do have access to statutory sick pay, it's only paid at £95 a week. And many people know that that would leave them short from what they need to pay the rent, feed the family. So, my appeal to the government, when I talk about the campaign, it's a campaign on the government to cover people's wages in full if they get a message from the test and trace system to self-isolate. It's a simple call, actually. People shouldn't be penalised from following government advice and protecting their own health. And the sad thing is we have too many people in the Northwest who aren't paid enough to protect their health. And that is a reflection of where we've got to as a society. If we're going to level up, let's start with helping people level up now. And that means If you're asked to self-isolate, you can do so knowing that your wages will be paid. And I'm asking the government to come to an arrangement with employers to put this system in place as soon as possible. It must be in place ahead of the winter. Heading into a winter without a vaccine, with people who can't take that time off work, is just not right morally, that they should be in that position.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to take a question from Aaron at Roch Valley Radio, but also just to say to colleagues in the media, if they do want to submit questions, they can do now, because we don't have very many after this one at the moment. Aaron said, in the last week, 76 new cases of coronavirus were recorded in Rochdale. At what point will you consider advising a local lockdown on the town, and how worrying is Rochdale's COVID situation to nearby towns, including Bury and Oldham?
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's obviously, as I said before, a high number of cases, 46 per 100,000 on the 7-day rolling average that we've published this afternoon. But there is a big but here. It's nowhere near where Leicester was when it went into lockdown. Leicester was, I think, 146, something like that. Very different position. And it's also some way behind Blackburn, which I think has been as high as 70, 80 or 90. So it's not in that position, Aaron. I mean, that's the first thing to say. And also, I've got great confidence, as I said, in what the council, the leader, chief executive and the teams on the ground are doing in Rochdale. They have been testing a lot in the community for some time. They very much are on top of things and taking all of the steps that you would think should be taken. So they are not in the same position, certainly not as Leicester, and actually not as Blackburn either. But no one here is complacent, and that's why we're being open about this. It's higher than we would like. Hence the work that's going on to bring it down. And we publish these figures for that reason. That we all have to keep an eye to all of our neighbours in Greater Manchester, because obviously a high infection rate in one borough could in the end lead to transmission within another. So it's why we're publishing the figures for our 10 boroughs like this every week. And we would encourage everybody to take note of these and to think about the journeys that they make, and to follow the advice that Rochdale NPC have put out. So overall, as I said, this is an encouraging picture in that the cases continue to come down. And if you actually look at the number of people in hospital with COVID, the figures are right down. Across Greater Manchester, just 5 hospital admissions yesterday for people with COVID. That is massively down on what it was a month ago, certainly hugely down on 3 months ago. Just 10 people in intensive care and 130 people in non-ICU beds. I mean, these figures are way down on what they were a few weeks ago. So, we need to put everything you see on the table on the figures for new cases in the context of what's also going on in our hospitals and our healthcare system. The level of pressure is right down on what it was. But of course, we don't want it to go up again, and hence the level of vigilance that we are applying to the situation in Greater Manchester.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to take a question from Louise Martin at BBC News, and I'll take a question from Trevor Baxter. The question from Louise is, Boris Johnson says he wants the UK to be back to a significant normality by Christmas. Do you think this is achievable?
It would be nice, but I just don't think you can bank on that, and I don't think it's helpful to suggest that things can go ahead of what the reality might be, Louise. So I would say to the government, if you do the things that I've asked today, i.e. put the resources in at local level, help councils employ contact tracers, help every single employee in the UK to self-isolate immediately if they get that message from the test and trace system. Shore up our defences. So to plug those holes that I have been pointing out in recent weeks. That localised data in terms of named patient data, that was a massive hole. It took us ages to get that filled. I would say to the government, if you fill these gaps in our defences that I'm pointing out, there is a chance we might be able to build some confidence and return to a degree of normality. But you can't wish that if you're not also prepared to put in the measures that make it possible to shore up our defences. And that will be my message back to the Prime Minister. Of course, we all want that, but it can't just be wished without the means to make it possible. And we mustn't, in my view, underestimate the challenges that this winter present. Going into it without a vaccine, with a normal flu season. I'm already talking to public health directors in Greater Manchester about how we maximise take-up of the flu vaccine this winter, how we get that going as quickly as possible. The winter actually presents massive challenges to the NHS and our 10 councils. And I think it isn't going to feel like normality at all to them. It's going to be a really challenging period. And I think the more we're realistic about that, rather than suggesting everything's going to be back to normal, I think we'd be in a better place to face what's coming.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to take a question from Trevor Baxter, who I think is from the Saddleworth Independent. Accepting there's no easy fix and there would be issues over the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, would you support a temporary closure of Dovestone Reservoir until more sustainable solutions to the problems of excess traffic, limited parking, antisocial behaviour, overcrowding, moorland fires, littering and others can be found?
It's a good question, Trevor. I mean, I've paid a couple of visits up to Dovestone in the last couple of years, so I'm very familiar with the layout, and I see the pictures on days when it's decent weather, and the overloading, if you like, of the road infrastructure around the access to the site. So I understand the problem that you're describing. Should we close off access to people? Obviously, access to green space is really important for people at a time like this. But I do know now we're having significant problems with regard to the traffic and the antisocial behaviour, as you say. On the moorland fires, I've called before for a change in the law to make it a criminal offence to take a disposable barbecue and light it up on the moors. So there are things that can be done there, but I wouldn't rule this out, but it obviously would be better to see if we could find other ways in which people can safely access the site. Certainly it needs to be open to pedestrians and cyclists come what may, because of the important access to green space. So it wouldn't be my kind of first instinct to support closure of the reservoir. But I would want to provide whatever support I could to Oldham Council, working with GMP, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, and other partners to see if there are better ways of managing the visitors to the site. And if we could encourage more walking and cycling towards the site, then I think that would be helpful.
Just a very quick supplementary as well from Trevor. There were plans to build a visitor centre by the RSPB at Dovestone. Would you support resurrecting those plans?
Well, yes. I mean, I think there is a centre at the moment, isn't there? I think those plans were to enhance it. I think it's a wonderful. It's a bit of a jewel in the Greater Manchester crown, to be honest. I was going to say it's a best kept secret, but that would undermine what I was saying about the numbers of people arriving now, because a lot of people do love it, and obviously we would want to enhance it as much as possible. It's I say it's a fantastic resource that we've got. We need to look after it, and if we could enhance it with a visitor centre, then yes, of course, I would support that.
Thanks very much. We've got a lot of questions in, but I'm just going to try and take questions from those who haven't had one asked first. So Niall Griffiths from the MEN wants to talk about the GMSF. He's asking, how confident are you that the GMSF will be endorsed by all 10 councils, and what happens if one votes against the plans? And Jennifer Williams asks, what proportion of Greenbelt is now set to be allocated for development in this next draft, or is the draft complete?
Okay, thanks, Niall. Firstly, on your question, reasonable high level of confidence, because we've been working at this for some time, and the councils all the time are amending their plans, improving their plans, and I think the message is understood, certainly by the two main political parties, that it's better to have a plan. If you kind of follow those who say just rip it all up, let's have no plan, most sensible people realise that that is to expose the Greenbelt to the maximum possible risk. So that argument doesn't work actually for the majority of people, and as far as I understand it, particularly Conservative Party, Labour Party, both say, look, it's important to have a plan, and if we can agree about that plan, then so much the better. So I think there's a reasonable degree of confidence, if the final work can be done on it, to respond to those large number of replies we got from the public, that this will be able to go through. It is going forward now as what's called a DPD. I won't go into all of the technical details, but effectively this is a plan of the 10 councils coming together. And I'm pretty confident in saying that if one pulls out, it would obviously go forward as a plan of the 9 or the 8 if 2 pulled out. But I'm pretty hopeful we won't get to that position. So to follow on to Jen's question, Ross, I want to see further reductions to the Greenbelt take. I've been very clear about that, and I'm talking, Jen, about reductions from the plan that was issued in January 2019. There were a lot of replies to the consultation, not as many, I must say, as the first time that we went out for consultation on the GMSF, but there were a lot of replies and responses on particular sites, and work has been ongoing to see if we can further refine the plans. As I said earlier, we've also got £81 million of brownfield remediation funding, which really helps us advance our ambitions for more development in urban suburban centres. So it's a position that will be different again, that will respond to the consultation. No doubt difficult decisions still there as part of it, but I hope the Greater Manchester public will see we are trying our best to listen to what's being said, and to come up with a plan that in the end people will find is an acceptable compromise.
Thanks, Andy. Follow up from Jen. Quick question on the Rochdale figures. Are you using the same measures that you've been using all the way through in the statistics you gave? Because last week you quoted a figure of 23.4, whereas the chart now shows it being 40 or above for some time. Just in a kind of effort to be consistent on what we report. I think Jen and probably others would just like to understand.
Yeah, no, I fully understand that concern, Jen, and obviously we've been a little bit of a victim of kind of being new to some of the data and it coming in a patchy way, not arriving in a timely way. So we've tried to give you, as we've gone along, what we had in the interest of openness, but obviously we didn't and weren't getting everything we needed at the time. And the figure you quote of last week was the very up-to-date figure that we had on the latest data. So we gave you more up-to-date figures last week. But what we know actually is that if you give figures close to when they've been published in terms of the test date, they can be revised afterwards and they can kind of go up. So actually what these figures represent is kind of moving back a little bit to make sure the figures are fully verified. So there's two ways of thinking about this. In the end, we think this is a better way of presenting the data to you. It wasn't that the data we presented last week wasn't accurate. It was accurate. It's just that it is subsequently revised upwards by Public Health England. So the figures you've got today take those very recent days figures out of the 7-day rolling average. And by doing that, we think this gives you a sort of a more accurate picture and is more aligned to what Public Health England do. So I hope that explains it. I think it is partly just because, you know, we've been kind of struggling, as you know, to get the data on time, to have complete data. But finally, we're in a position where we feel we've got it. We've got a shared understanding with Public Health England, and I think now this table that we're publishing today reflects it. But you know, just want you to know that last week it was we thought we were, you know, we were giving you the most up to date, but that because those figures for the most up to date days can change later down the line, it can then sort of bring the rolling day average down a little bit, if that makes sense. So it's complicated situation. There's probably no right or wrong answer, but I think there's a kind of a consensus growing now around this is the best way of presenting this this data to you, and is least likely to change from the position that we're putting out today.
Thanks, Andy. A quick question from Adam Clark. Have you got an update on face mask compliance on public transport?
The last update I had, Adam, was late last week following the commencement of our week of action, and the results were good. There'd certainly been a further improvement last week. We were up to 90% compliance on some Metrolink services, not all, late last week, and people had responded well to the extra enforcement activity that we'd been putting on the system. So I think bus is kind of a little bit behind Metrolink, but still I think we're looking at 70 to 80% compliance. So we continue to work at it. The week of action continues, but you know, we think when the change comes in about compulsory wearing of face coverings in shops, as it will come in at the weekend, we think that will further drive compliance on public transport. So we're getting close to the right position now. Of course, there are some people who have a legitimate reason not to wear a face covering on public transport, so we'll never get to 100% compliance. But I'm really grateful to the public actually for the way that they've dealt with this. The levels are growing all of the time, and obviously the more that people wear masks, you know, the more we're protecting each other and returning to work safely, which is what we want to see.
A question from Elizabeth at the Rochdale Observer. Rochdale councillors discussed a motion this week stating that any official government inquiry on its handling of COVID must address the disproportionate impact on communities of colour. Has GMCA been able to do enough to support those communities who have been known to be at higher risk since early in the pandemic?
Well, I think there certainly does need to be an inquiry into the support for communities with the biggest challenges through this, and it's what I've been saying today, Elizabeth. Why have the poorest communities been hardest hit? And often those communities are communities in the Black, Asian community. Why is that? Because they are overrepresented in lower paid jobs where there isn't the same employment security, and there is a higher degree of overcrowded, poor standard housing within those communities. And you know, the big issues here for me are inequality within our country, particularly as it links to work and housing. I would like to see moves at a national level to introduce a good employment charter. I think it is very wrong, actually, that the first announcement on public sector pay from the government has talked about pay at the more senior levels, but not addressed pay, particularly of people working in social care. I think that just shows we're not responding to what we've learned during this crisis, and we are not building back better. We're not learning the lessons properly. But I also think there needs to be a big drive on the quality of housing in some of our poorest communities. And we would certainly be calling for regulation of the private rented sector, alongside a new drive to build a new generation of zero carbon homes for social rent. So yes, there's got to be real change, and we need honesty about how this virus has disproportionately impacted on different communities, and particularly on Black and Asian communities. It's something that is really quite disturbing. And we saw this laid out actually in the Marmot report earlier this year on health inequalities. All the evidence is there, and it actually clearly lays out how those communities were at much more risk of poorer health, and the virus has brutally exposed that. And I'm looking for the government to show a serious response to this. You can't talk about levelling up with shiny new infrastructure until you start addressing some of the basics in our poorest communities around the quality of people's work and the quality of people's housing.
And what looks to be our final question, unless any more come in, Aaron from Roch Valley Radio asks, in wanting to create a London-style transport system, are you worried at all that Mancunians may think their city is turning into a northern version of London?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Aaron. I saw a Tory minister yesterday having a go at the Manchester elite, which I didn't know how to take that, to be honest. I thought that I couldn't have imagined I'd ever see the day that a Tory minister would have thought the BBC would pander to a Manchester elite. Maybe that's a sign of social progress. I don't know, but no, I don't think that. I honestly don't think that will ever be the case, that Manchester will turn into a pale imitation of London. It just won't happen. London has its own strengths, and we like it for different reasons. Manchester is Manchester because we do things differently, and it's a different place, different strengths. I just think it's a basic that any city should have. I call it London style, but you could call it European style, couldn't you? Transport that is affordable, clean, modern, reliable, accessible. We haven't got that at the moment, and that's what I mean when I say London style, particularly a cap over what people can spend. If you travel around Manchester now, you can pay a lot of money as you move from mode to mode. We've got to get away from that. We've got to have a single integrated transport system where it doesn't matter how many buses or trams you travel on any given day. There is only so much you can spend on public transport. And actually, it's only when we have that public transport will be the first port of call rather than the car. And until that is the case, we will not be on the right path towards building back greener. So you could call it London style, you could call it European style. I don't mind. I know what we want, and I'm determined to get it as quickly as possible. So the government are talking about setting up a Northern Transport Acceleration Council. My message to them is that can't be about the big infrastructure delivered in 20 or 30 years' time. I want to see change on the ground in Manchester in the next 3 to 5 years, particularly a transport system that is as affordable to people as London transport is, as clean, as modern, and also zero emission. So that's what we want to work on, Aaron. But I think if we had a transport system like that, it wouldn't change us in any way. It would just help us get people moving around better and enjoying the unique strengths that Greater Manchester has got to offer.
Thanks, Andy. One last question just come in from Jennifer Williams. I'll ask this one, and then if you've got any final thoughts. Question on clean air. How worried are you about the prospect of legal challenge from client Earth? They've previously said that the plan doesn't cut emissions fast enough to hit legal targets.
Well, I probably would say to client Earth, Jen, to work with us. What we're proposing here is the largest clean air zone in the country. It's an ambitious proposal, but it's the right proposal because we have polluted illegal air in all 10 of our boroughs. And if we were to do a partial solution, it probably wouldn't solve the problem. So, this is a major undertaking that is going to require a lot of effort. And, client Earth need to realise we'll have other people on the other side of us saying it goes too far. There's a challenging time for business. We've got to try and find a kind of a proposal here that takes everybody with us. And as I said before, we think we can get a cross-party consensus behind this as long as the government steps forward with the funding to help people switch vehicles. So we don't have that commitment at the moment. And if this starts to be called a clean air tax, I would say to Client Earth, that's not going to help, you get public support for what you're trying to achieve. We all want the same thing, which is non-polluted, compliant air swirling across the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester. That's what we all want. And I just think, this is a challenging moment, isn't it? Because of all of the pressures on public authorities at the moment. Work with us, try and help us to do this, but let's do it in a way that takes the public with us.
That's all the questions we have.
Great. Okay, Ross. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your questions. Not much to say in conclusion, other than I think this week we finally got to a point now with this table that we've put before you that I think is a steady state with regard to these statistics as we move forward. And it's taken too long to get here, but we are here now. We've got a complete picture for our 10 boroughs. And that is a better place to be now as we move into the second half of the year. So, there is some change here in terms of the way these things have been presented to you, but it's been because of the way the data has come to us. But, what you will get from here is, a clear and consistent voice back to the government about how it is on the ground. And I hope you can see that because of some of the advocacy Greater Manchester has been able to make in recent times through this press briefing every week, hopefully we've moved the national debate into a better position for all councils. But as I've said today, there are areas where the government needs to go further with that support for troops on the ground to help with contact tracing, and critically that support for people to follow the government's advice and self-isolate if they need to. Do these things, we do them together, we can build that sense of national local partnership. And I think we can continue to rise to this challenge. So we know what we need to do. We just got to get on and do it. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you all next week.